Emmanuel Macron has suggested that there should be Western boots on the ground in Ukraine, or at any rate they shouldn't be ruled out. The French president lobbed this diplomatic hand grenade on Monday before Stéphane Séjourné, the French foreign minister, laid down covering fire for Mr. Macron Tuesday by suggesting that any NATO deployment to Ukraine would be limited to training and advisory missions. The rift among NATO allies has predictably delighted Moscow, and they have warned that a NATO force of any kind in Ukraine would lead to all-out war. Macron's idea may have split NATO, but is not wholly without precedent. Advisors and trainers from both sides were present for many years, many of the Cold War's proxy conflicts. Soviet pilots even flew combat missions against US forces during the Korean War. So what are the risks, and why is President Macron suggesting a red line this time? Well, with me now is Richard Sakwa, a noted expert on the war in Ukraine and professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent. Richard, thank you very much for joining me. Does Macron have a point? Do we need to do this to help make sure Ukraine wins?
No, in fact, the opposite. I think that his statement is a sign that perhaps the West is beginning to feel that they may not win the war. So it's a sign of desperation rather than a forward-thinking strategic move. What he's done is opened the discussion. He did say, of course, everything should be on the table. He didn't say that it's immediately going to happen, but he's opened what people call the Overton window of what's permissible to talk about.
OK, and so having opened it, have the other NATO members like the UK closed it again? Because the reaction's been quite swift, hasn't it? And the concern about allowing this war to escalate into a war between Russia and the West is a serious one.
Yes, after the comment, a whole stack of countries, Germany, UK, others have said that there's no immediate prospect for direct forces, NATO forces, to be engaged. On the other hand, what Macron was thinking about, I think, was bilateral engagement, so it wasn't going to be a NATO force. And in any case, there are forces there already. There's giving technical support, there's special units, there's intelligence operations, as you saw in the New York Times just the other day. There's 12 CIA bases plus a main command center. So NATO is fully involved even now.
And you're worried that this is a sign of desperation. So what can we do to help Ukraine? Or are you genuinely concerned that Russia has the upper hand?
Well, I mean, it's clear Russia does have the upper hand, whether I like it or not. It's moving forwards. The other day, the major bastion town of Avdiivka fell, and Russia's pushing forwards. I think that some people are arguing now that it could even, the line of contact at the moment, which has been more or less in stalemate for the last few months, could collapse fairly soon. So what I think another of the participants in this meeting in Paris where they talked about this was the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico. And he came out of this meeting and said, what he was astonished about was that no one talked about peace or any negotiation process. So this martial spirit isn't going to get anywhere because Russia's got nuclear weapons at the end of the day. So it's always got what Obama said, maybe your favorite person, escalation dominance. So in that context, we should step back and not escalate, but think of a way to get some peace out of this, some sort of honorable peace for all sides.
But Russia's always had that escalation option, but we've got the same, haven't we? So the deterrence ability or the deterrence reality of nuclear weapons works for both sides if Putin were to go down that route. And if he's not a complete madman, then you must assume that it will carry on as a conventional war.
No, it's quite possible, but there's plenty of talk in Russia. Don't forget that Putin is under huge pressure from even harder liners to do something against this endless escalation. As Macron said, first of all, they said they weren't going to supply tanks, then they did. They weren't going to supply the F-16s, and then they did. So in Moscow, the debate is, look, come on, guys, we've got to fight back. And some are arguing perhaps a preemptive nuclear strike, a small one, but just to bring the West to its senses. I mean, it's crazy, all talk, but both sides go escalation. But we could slide into a nuclear confrontation. I think that's the huge danger at this time.
Well, isn't there a risk that even a small nuclear strike would lead to Russia just being wiped out by the US? I mean, the US has overwhelming firepower in nuclear weapons and might use it, that they can't be certain that the US would just accept a nuclear strike.
Well, exactly. Or it could go the other way. Hang on, they're saying this is just so dangerous. We ought to sit down and start negotiating. What are Russia's demands? What are Ukraine's demands? What are the West's demands? But don't forget that it was the West pushing it forwards against endless warnings, which provoked the war in the first place. I'm not justifying it, of course, but I'm saying it will have to explain the context and the history behind it. And only by understanding that can we begin to find some sort of sensible exit strategy. With a bit of luck, Russia will be still in existence at the end of this war, Ukraine hopefully as well, and we also. So we must start now to think of a way out, not by sending more weapons and putting boots on the ground. This is how Vietnam happened. Don't forget, there's endless talk of domino theories and so on, which proved in the end totally mistaken.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. With me now is Civitas Senior Fellow Robert Clark, who has just arrived home from Ukraine. Robert, thank you very much for joining me. What were you seeing on the ground when you were in Ukraine?
Thank you very much for having me. Good evening. So I was in Kyiv and a bit further north in the Chernihiv Oblast, and I was lucky enough to meet with several fighters and Ukrainian armed forces who have returned from both Bakhmut and Avdiivka in recent weeks of fighting. And really, there's four things now that the Ukrainian armed forces are almost crying out for. Everyone has heard, obviously, of the ammunition and the artillery shortages, which have been compounded by the indecision, both in Washington and Brussels, to release much needed military aid to Ukraine. So there is the artillery and the ammunition shortage. There's also a crying need for cyber defense and increased border security against the northern border with Belarus. But also, as well, just more importantly, the continued British presence, for example, training Ukrainian armed forces here in the UK and in Germany under NATO and British frameworks. That's having a real sort of force multiplier, if you like, on the ground. And also, and this comes back to President Macron's incredibly ill thought out and ill conceived of policies regarding French defence. And that's also the need for Ukraine to really demine and sort of get to grips with the problems of the mined territory that it currently has. It's about the combined size of England and Scotland are currently mined in Ukraine. And there's great operations out there like the Halo Trust and other NGOs. But this is where France can play like a leading role, if you like. France has a well-renowned and well-deserved, to be fair, expertise in demining. So there's tangible policies that Macron can achieve without trying to grandstand and sort of coming out of increasingly sort of strange rhetoric.
Well, I don't know if you heard the interview I was having with Richard beforehand, and whether you're worried that we do need to be trying to get a peace because how many arms we send, it's not going to be enough, and that Russia may need nuclear weapons. Is that what you feel the Ukrainians would be ready for, or are they still very much feeling that they can win?
I think the Ukrainians are increasingly, if anything, feeling like they can win, despite the troubles and the setbacks they had last year in the counter-offensive. In terms of going forwards, it is almost a stalemate. Most people don't like to use that phrase, but militarily speaking, it's actually quite accurate. There's going to be no real sizable push by the Ukrainians this year. They're trying to consolidate their own defences and their own hard-won territory. But what the West really need to do now in terms of helping Ukraine further is really sort of helping the Ukrainian domestic defense policy. So increasing Ukraine's organic ability to regenerate militarily and not just rely on Western aid for years to come. We can already see just how depleted, in particular, British stocks are.
And is there more that we can do as the West? Obviously, there's the support package stuck in Congress in the United States, but can the West do more to help, or has the maximum help been provided?
I wouldn't say the maximum has been provided. Just to put it into context, I know the figure of around £2.5 billion of military aid to Ukraine this year by the British government does sound like a lot of money to the British taxpayer, who understandably are dealing with the cost of living crisis. I appreciate that. But to put that figure into context, £2.5 billion is roughly around 5% of our defence budget. So that's incredibly good sort of bang for your buck, if you like, in terms of ensuring European security. That could be increased, of course it can. But just like our own hollowed out armed forces and our depleted budget, it's not just a case of assigning a random arbitrary figure. It's actually looking where the gaps lie. And like I mentioned a moment ago, in terms of air defence, cyber capability, demining, and increasing Ukraine's own organic domestic supply for regenerating militarily, just like the Russians are doing at pace and scale, that's really going to help Ukraine go forwards. And we can, of course, do.
Well, thank you, Robert, and thank you so much for bringing your first-hand experience, having come back from Ukraine recently.